Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I'm so happy to be able to do this episode with you all. I have here with me Fern Schumer Chap, an author, who is of course going to be joining me for Verbal Abuse and Sibling Estrangement Part 2. Now, not all sibling conflict is abuse, but a lot of abuse gets dismissed as conflict. Verbal abuse, if left unchecked, can have lasting effects on one's self-esteem and self-identity, like we saw in Part 1. Maybe you've experienced these subtle and not so subtle moments of verbal abuse within your family or from your sibling. So, in today's episode, we'll be discussing, in a sibling estrangement context, how psychology understands it and what we can do to stop it. So, Fern, it's great to have you here again. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about on this topic. Victims often struggle with low self-esteem. They doubt their worth, their abilities, and it can lead to anxiety and depression. This is especially true, I believe, when it's a younger sibling because they look up often to the older sibling who may fill a kind of parent-like role. And so we take their opinions very seriously. And if they're verbally abusive, we're especially hurt by that kind of action. So, yeah, I'm excited to hear what we can do about it.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that. So, let's talk about what the psychology says for starters. I think one of the hardest parts about sibling verbal abuse is that people often try to understand it only through the lens of conflict. But many estranged siblings describe something deeper. They talk about confusion, erosion of self-worth, chronic anxiety around contact, feeling psychologically cornered, and emotionally unsafe long before they left. And I think
Right.
that's an important one too. So psychology especially talks about this with number one here, the power and control lens, right? Because of the fact that this isn't just communication, it's really relational positioning. And one of the biggest misconceptions about verbal abuse is the idea that they just have poor communication skills. And sometimes that's true, but in abusive dynamics, the issue is often not expression, it's really about control, right?
And it's ongoing. And
Mm-hmm.
so it causes chronic grief and guilt and loss. So,
Yep.
it's not so easy to get past. And as you said in the beginning, it shapes identity.
Absolutely. The goal may become, for instance, dominating the conversation, defining reality, maintaining superiority, avoiding accountability, keeping another sibling psychologically small and such, right? So, this same pattern repeated over and over again can cause us to feel dismissed, ridiculed, invalidated, intimidated, humiliated, and such, and often under the guise of moral superiority. And the targeted sibling often slowly learns that there is no safe way to disagree with my sibling. And that's psychologically important because healthy conflict often involves mutual influence, repair, accountability, emotional reciprocity. And abusive dynamics often do the opposite. One person gets to define what's true, and the other person adapts, appeases, or withdraws.
Right. It's your typical walking on eggshells dynamic. And we talked a little bit in the last video about the importance of paying attention to your body,
Yep.
and that will tell the truth.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Another aspect that's important for us is attachment theory. The relationship becomes emotionally unsafe. And attachment theory helps to explain why sibling verbal abuse can cut so deeply, even in adulthood. And I think siblings are often among our earliest long term attachment relationships, which we've spoken of before, and they shape our belonging, our identity, emotional safety, and self worth within the family. And when verbal abuse becomes chronic, the nervous system starts to associate the sibling with shame, rejection, unpredictability, emotional danger. And this can really create attachment injuries that persist for years if we're not careful.
And estrangement.
Right? Right?
I mean,
Exactly.
I think when you feel all those things, the impulse is to cut off because that's the only safe place.
Yes, oftentimes that can be the experience that a number of us have, especially going through this. And another thing that happens is trauma that happens in our bodies is the experience that repeated verbal attack starts to feel like a threat. And many people underestimate verbal abuse because there's no visible bruises. But on a psychological and neurological level, repeated verbal aggression activates the stress and threat systems in the brain, especially when the person feels trapped, powerless, chronically targeted, emotionally unsafe, and such. The nervous system begins operating in survival states of hypervigilance, shutdown, anxiety, emotional flooding, which is a big one for a lot of us, and dissociation.
Yeah. And I think this is a little bit like the water boiling the frog. You
Yep.
know, it's getting warmer and warmer, and pretty soon the frog's dead because the water is so hot. But
Yeah.
we grow accustomed to certain behaviors and we excuse the behaviors and we keep, letting out more and more leash, if to mix my metaphors. And it's a dangerous path.
Yes, yes, and I think that's really important to be mindful of that, especially with identity level trauma. Over time, verbal abuse can move beyond hurt feelings and into identity formation. And if someone repeatedly hears you're selfish, you're unstable, you're the problem, you ruin everything, the brain slowly starts to internalize these messages as truth. And this is especially powerful inside family systems because family voices often become inner voices. So even after estrangement, many people continue to carry, for example, feelings of shame, self doubt, chronic self criticism, fear of conflict, and difficulty in trusting themselves, which is a big one.
Wow. This is
Hmm.
very toxic.
Yeah. So really need to be careful about that. Now, the next one in psychology is cognitive distortions and internalization, right? The abuse continues internally. So, one of the most painful aspects of verbal abuse is that eventually the sibling may no longer need to say the words out loud. The targeted person starts saying them internally. You've internalized that dialogue. And in psychology, they call this internalization. And the common internalized beliefs may be, for example, maybe I really am too sensitive. I always ruin relationships. Maybe my memories are wrong. I'm difficult. I'm the problem. And this really creates chronic cognitive distortions such as personalization that we've talked about before, catastrophizing, that if I start to speak honestly, everything will explode, for example. Emotional reasoning, because I feel guilty, I must be doing something wrong, which is, I think, really, really careful for a number of our viewers to be mindful of. Self-silencing, the person may stop expressing needs, emotions, boundaries, and disagreement. So there's this idea of self-erasing ourselves, right? And I think that what's difficult with this one is the idea that you've already got this within yourself, and you no longer need to have your sibling there to somehow fuel this because the internalization does it on its own.
Yeah, I think your point about family voices become internal voices is very important. And one thing that, you talked about the intensity of this relationship between siblings, it's also the longest relationship. So you could be emotionally abused for 80 years if you're
Yeah,
not careful.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so yeah.
So I think that's really important. If we're not careful, if we don't act and such, and start to look at what we can do with this, which we're going to be getting into very shortly, that's very important that we have some resources for our viewers like this. So the last point that's mentioned is within family systems theory, the problem may be not just be with the sibling, it may be the system itself.
Mhm.
And family systems theory looks at how entire families unconsciously stabilize themselves around roles and patterns. So
Right.
sometimes verbal abuse is not merely an individual issue, it becomes embedded in the family structure and
And,
such.
and gender plays into that. I talk
Yeah,
to a lot of women, particularly who feel they have been scapegoated within a family that's more patriarchal.
yeah, especially when there's this idea of felt hierarchy, especially, right? That there's a hierarchy and that we're somehow not among the upper echelons of this hierarchy or made to feel as though we're not equal on an equal footing with others. I think that's really important, especially in family systems, to be mindful of that. So, Fern, let's talk about what we can do now. I think this is important that we move on to this because I think our viewers are really especially keen on wanting to have some strategies with this. So let's talk about that. And I think that protecting ourselves in a relationship is really important. And how is it that we can feel safe? And I think that having a few grounding points as a starter is really important for us. And one of them I think that is important is to start by naming the experience accurately,
Mhm.
right? And it's a surprisingly simple step when you start naming what's actually happening without minimizing it. It's not just my sibling and I are having tension together, but maybe it's when I engage, I often feel dismissed, confused, or emotionally unsafe, right?
But one of the keys to this is actually labeling the emotion. It's one thing to say, I feel dismissed, but really, what is the feeling attached to that?
Yeah, it's very important and such. And to be able to name that. And I think that naming it helps to shift you out of confusion and bring you into clarity. And confusion is one of the main features of unsafe dynamics. So the first intervention is internal. What am I actually experiencing in this relationship? Not what you should be experiencing, what you actually are.
Right. This is where writing becomes so valuable. If you write what you feel in your gut and what the emotions are, you will find a release and
Yeah,
an identification.
yeah, absolutely. And that's a good one to do that, especially with writing, because it brings us to our second point, right? Track your nervous system, not just the conversation. It's a big one when you start to pay attention to your body. A lot of people stay stuck trying to solve the content of the argument and they keep it very much intellectual and such, and saying who said what and who's right and who misunderstood. But trauma informed work asks a different question. It asks, what happens inside me when I'm in contact with this person? Do I tighten? Do I shut down? Do I tend to over explain? Feel flooded? Do I feel small? And those are really not random reactions. They're information about us. And often they're more reliable than the content of the conversation itself because our nervous system remembers patterns, right?
Right. And I think when you have that information, you have to begin to ask yourself the value of the relationship and how it is affecting you. Because if it's making you sick, it's probably not something you want to continue.
Exactly, exactly. So important to listen to that feeling and such, and to see what our bodies are saying. And number three is separating explanation from exposure, and this is a very important shift, right? A lot of times, people in difficult sibling dynamics try to heal the relationship through explanation, and if I can just explain it better, they might finally understand. The no rocks left unturned theory that I've come up with, I think, especially that I mentioned in some of the support groups, right? I think this is a big one. In many stained and abusive dynamics, more explanation doesn't create understanding. It creates more exposure, right?
Yeah, I mean, you hope that honest conversations will lead to a, a closer connection, but it's not always the case if somebody's emotionally abusive. They may just use that against you.
Exactly, because it becomes more material to be dismissed, more emotional vulnerability to be minimized, right? So the key question becomes, is this a moment where sharing brings clarity or does it cost me safety? Hmm.
Right. And also, I always think of that great Maya Angelou quote that when somebody shows you who they are, believe them the first time.
Yes.
Because I know I have a tendency to say, oh, well, wait a minute, let me
Yep.
give this person another chance. And of course, you give them another chance and you realize you're going to get smacked again.
Right? Exactly. So sometimes the most therapeutic action is not to say more, it's actually to say less. Very important. So, number four is defining your boundary in terms of behavior, not persuasion. So, boundaries are often misunderstood as attempts to change the other person. But psychologically, a boundary is not a request, it's a limit on participation. So, instead of saying I need to be more respectful, which depends on them, it could become something along the lines of if the conversation turns into criticism or contempt or cruelty, I'll end the interaction.
Right. And that takes a lot of presence of mind to do that
Yeah.
because you get so caught up in the heat of the moment and you want to defend yourself.
Yeah.
But that's actually a trap in itself. It's better to observe.
Yes, very much so. And that shift is crucial because it moves you from trying to control the other person's behavior to controlling your access to harm. And that's a
Mhm.
big one.
It's protection.
Yeah, exactly. So, number five is normalizing distance as regulation, not punishment. So, in family systems, especially, distance often gets morally loaded. You're abandoning the relationship. But in trauma informed thinking, distance can also be regulation, clarity, protection, or recovery.
Yeah, it's complicated though for the person on the other end of it if they don't understand what's going on.
Yeah. And that's important, even for us to have to do this type of thing where we pull back and such. It's important to give ourselves a helpful reframe, which is really, is my distance coming from punishment or from nervous system care?
Mm.
We're not being bad people for pulling away. We're doing it because we need to have a bit of space so we can gain clarity and peace of mind, especially. And
Yeah,
that distinction matters.
wouldn't it be nice if we could actually have a civilized conversation and state our objectives and try to work past the rupture?
That would be great, wouldn't it? So, the last point now is number six, to rebuild safely internally, not only relationally. And we can't always make a relationship safe. I think this is a big one, especially for people to hear. But you can rebuild your internal experience of safety. And that includes validating your own perception, noticing your emotional responses without judgment, grounding your body after contact, and returning to relationships where you feel mutually respected.
Yeah, I think when you've been hurt, there's a tendency to inflate the importance of the exchange and ruminate on what went wrong and what happened. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you have to shrink that relationship and that conversation so that it has its proper perspective in your life. It's not your whole life, it's just one aspect.
Right? Exactly. So, in other words, you begin to become the place where your experience is believed again. And that's important, right? That you give yourself a certain sense of authenticity and authority over yourself. And that's important that that level of trust starts to happen within yourself. So, so important. And that's not really being abstract. That's where healing occurs.
It's really hard for people who have never experienced this kind of protection from parents to actually protect themselves.
Yeah,
So, and usually in these families where there is this kind of verbal abuse, um, people don't know how to have sustaining, honest relationships.
exactly. So, my hope today is that through our conversation together here, Fern, that people were able to gain some insights into what psychology says out of this, what particular aspect might stand out most for them, especially, and also what they can do, right? Recognizing that there's options with this and recognizing where we get stuck, recognizing where it is that we can maybe make a different decision with regards to our own responses to these types of experiences. And that can really help to make the difference between moving closer to suffering or moving closer to healing and harmonizing ourselves with all this.
Right. And actually, that would lead me to my key resource, and that is using writing as a tool to understand yourself and how you want to relate to others. The Sibling Estrangement Journal, which I created to help sort out these difficult relationships, is a great opportunity to use writing and to sort out who you are and how you feel.
Absolutely. Great resource right there. My number one resource at this time is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group on Zoom. That's also going, and that's very important that people can join in if they want to have a space where they can experience this sense of relief and sense of gaining more empowerment and tools to be able to manage through sibling estrangement, especially. People can reach out to me if they'd like to have further counseling on this and dive deeper into their own individual experiences through therapy. I am taking on clients for this, and also I do offer some workshops. The next one I'm working on is going to be this fall on people pleasing and sibling estrangement, which is very important if people want to break free from that pattern that can sometimes leave us stuck with experiencing more suffering when it comes to verbal abuse and such, and how it is that we sometimes go into unhealthy patterns that we need to gain more insight into and break free from. That's what the workshop's all about. So, Fern, thank you so much for doing this. It's so great to
Mhm.
be able to get together and talk about these important matters. There's so few resources out there on sibling estrangement, and I'm so glad that we're able to get together and offer this to our viewers. So,
Me too.
looking forward to our next video, Fern. You take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.